Hey everyone, do you remember the classic sounds of the 1950s? You might think of Elvis, Chuck Berry, or Little Richard, but today we're going beyond the big names. Today, we're highlighting 50 of the best bands from the 1950s that have been lost to time. Let's see what we've been missing. 50. Bill Haley and his Comets.
Bill Haley and his Comets.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Kickstarting the list with a true rock and roll pioneer, Bill Haley and his Comets were among the first to stick around to hear how they helped define the sound of the 50s. Among the first successful rock bands of the 1950s, Bill Haley and his Comets created a rock and roll classic with Rock Around the Clock, which has that quintessential 50s rock sound. The song was a #1 hit despite being on the B-side of one of their albums. Still, it's easy to see why these guys are considered one of the best rock bands of the 50s. Bill Haley and his Comets had staying power over the years too, only disbanding with Haley's death in 1981 after almost 30 years together. Fun fact, a young man named Elvis Presley once served as an opening act to the band. We wonder how his career turned out. 49. The Diamonds.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, the Diamonds with Little Darlin'.
This Canadian quartet isn't just another doo-wop group. The Diamonds mixed R&B with pop to create something fresh and unforgettable. Find out how they brought new sounds to the mainstream. The Diamonds are a vocal quartet that rocketed to popularity in the 1950s. Their work stood out for its introduction of R&B to the wider pop music industry. It was formed in 1953 by Dave Somerville and 3 fellow singers, Ted Kowalski, Phil Levitt, and Bill Reed. Originally signed to perform rock and roll, they were paired with jazz composer Pete Rugolo. This led them to play more to their roots as well as perform more standard songs.
And left to wrong. To hold in mind.
The Diamonds are a Canadian vocal quartet that rose to prominence in the 1950s and early 1960s with 16 Billboard hit records. The original members were Dave Somerville, lead, Ted Kowalski, tenor, Phil Levitt, baritone, and Bill Reed, bass. They were most noted for interpreting and introducing rhythm and blues vocal group music to the wider pop music audience. Contrary to a popular myth, the father of Tom Hanks was never a member of the group. 48. The Drifters.
Ain't no use in staying at home. Pick my baby up, take her to the picture show. Everybody in the neighborhood.
The Drifters gave us some of the biggest R&B hits of the 50s, but their story is one of constant change. Tune in to see how they kept the music going. Without Billy Ward and his Dominoes, there would be no Drifters. The Drifters were formed for Clyde McPhatter, a former member of the Billy Ward Band.
Well, we'll be swinging, dancing, and singing, baby, come on. Everybody give me the right hand clapping, y'all. Come on. Hey, come on. My picture you see. All right. I mean, you're hugging with the baby. That's for anybody.
These members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame dealt with several tumultuous years but still managed several successful songs during the decade. The 1950s version of the Drifters gave the world Money Honey, Honey Love, Adorable, and There Goes My Baby, all of which were #1 hits on the R&B charts at the time. The Drifters were formed in 1953 at the behest of Atlantic Records co-founder Ahmet Ertegun, who approached McFadder when the popular vocalist was dropped from Billy Ward and the Dominoes. After serving in the Army, McFadder left the Drifters in 1955 to pursue a solo career, but not before the group had reached #1 on the Billboard Rhythm and Blues charts with Money Honey, 1953, and scored several other hits including White Christmas, 1954. 3 lead singers later, in 1959, Treadwell replaced the entire group with another ensemble, the Five Crowns, led by King. Still recording for Atlantic, now under the guidance of writer-producers Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, the Drifters cracked the top 10 of the pop singles chart in 1959 with There Goes My Baby, remembered for its innovative use of strings and Latin rhythms, and took Save the Last Dance for Me, 1960, to #1. 47. The Robins. Before the Coasters, there were the Robins, one of the first groups to pioneer doo-wop. Find out how they made their mark with the smoothest harmonies. The Robins were a popular and important American R&B group in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and one of the first vocal groups to pioneer the doo-wop sound. Their song, Since I First Met You, is well known. Ty Terrell and twin brothers Billy and Roy Richards created the band. Bobby Nunn was quickly added to the lineup. They began their career as the Bluebirds, but in May 1949, they changed their name to the Robins and began recording. In June of 1949, the Robins released their first song, Around About Midnight, BW, You Sure Look Good to Me. Only a few weeks later, a second Aladdin single, Don't Like the Way You're Doing, BW, Come Back Baby, was released. They were then signed to the Savoy label, along with the rest of Otis's touring band, resulting in a series of recordings that included Johnny Otis playing with them and their participation on the single Double Crossin' Blues, which featured his main singer Esther Jones supporting him, aka Little Esther. 46. The Clovers.
Still think that it's even cuter yet the way the Clovers do it. So here they are, the Clovers.
The Clovers were a pivotal R&B group whose music helped bridge the gap between the smooth sounds of doo-wop and the raw energy of rock and roll. Stick around to hear how they created timeless hits and influenced future generations.
Were you the cutest thing that I did ever see? I really love you, peaches gonna...
Founded in 1946 in Washington, D.C., the Clovers became one of the most successful vocal groups of the 1950s, blending soulful harmonies with upbeat rhythms. Their chart-topping hits, including Love Potion No. 9, One Mint Julep, and Devil or Angel, were staples of the R&B scene.
Give it up, birdie mama. I can't wait because my love is tumbling down.
Known for their versatility and rich vocal arrangements, the Clovers were a consistent presence on the charts, making them a household name in their heyday. Despite lineup changes, the group continued to perform for decades, leaving behind a legacy that has influenced countless artists in the pop, rock, and R&B genres.
Can't get you out of my mind.
45. Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps.
Got to make you give me one more chance.
She's the queen of all the team. She's the woman that I know. Dance in the street tonight.
Rockabilly royalty, Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps brought us the timeless hit Bebop-A-Lula, but their story is more than just one song. Stick around to learn how Vincent's band influenced the future of rock and roll. Gene Vincent might not be as well known today, but he's considered both rock and roll and rockabilly royalty. Vincent helped to create that rockabilly sound that directly influenced artists like Elvis Presley.
You dip your hip, free your knee, squeal on your heel, baby, 1, 2, well, bing, bing, bop, bing, bing, bop, baby.
This influence cements his status as one of the best artists of the era. Vincent's 1956 hit Bebop-A-Lula launched his band into the spotlight. However, the iconic song Bebop-A-Lula ended up being the band's biggest hit, with subsequent releases never reaching the heights of this rockabilly classic. After Bebop-A-Lula became a hit, Vincent and his Blue Caps were unable to follow it up with the same level of commercial success, although they released critically acclaimed songs like Race with the Devil, number 96 on the US Billboard chart and number 50 on the US Cashbox chart, and Blue Jean Bop, number 49 on the US Billboard chart and another million-selling disc. Cliff Gallup left the band in 1956, and Russell Williford joined as the new guitarist for the Blue Caps. Williford played and toured Canada with Vincent in late 1956, but left the group in early 1957.
She's my baby. Bebop-A-Lula, don't make me baby.
Gallup came back to do the next album and then left again. Williford came back and exited again before Johnny Meeks joined the band. The group had another hit in 1957 with Lotta Lovin', highest position number 13 in spending 19 weeks on the Billboard chart and number 17 in 17 weeks on the Cashbox chart. Vincent was awarded gold records for 2 million sales of Bebop-A-Lula and 1.5 million sales of Lotta Lovin'. By the end of 1959, the Blue Caps were no longer part of the billing on Gene Vincent Records. The late 1959 single Wildcat was credited solely to Gene Vincent, and this would be the case on all subsequent Gene Vincent releases. 44. The Cadillacs. With their stylish moves and slick harmonies, the Cadillacs brought energy and showmanship to the stage. Discover the story behind the classic hit Speed-Oo and the drama that followed. From 1953 to 1962, the American rock and roll and doo-wop group The Cadillacs performed in Harlem, New York. The group gained notoriety with the Esther Navarro-penned 1955 hit song Speed-Oo, which played a significant role in introducing white audiences to black rock and roll musicians. The founding members of the group, Earl Carroll, lead vocalist, Bobby Phillips, Laverne Drake, bass vocalist, and Gus Willingham, formed the Carnations in 1953. James Papa Clark joined the group as a fifth member, and they entered the recording studios, and they were dubbed the Cadillacs after this. The group's debut album, Josie Records number 765, which included the songs Gloria and I Wonder Why, was released in July 1954. Some of the original members left and were replaced in 1955. The Cadillacs released a doo-wop rendition of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer the same year, and it peaked at number 11 on the Rhythm and Blues Records chart of Billboard magazine. In 1957, disagreements over ideas led to the group's dissolution. 43. The Crests.
I fell in love with you, and step by step, it wasn't hard to do.
The Crests didn't just make hits, they made memories. This group brought us 16 Candles and more, but but their success came with its own challenges. Let's dive into their rise to fame. The Crests are one of the most prominent doo-wop vocal groups of the 1950s, founded in Manhattan, New York in 1955.
We're all alone, 7-step, we took a chance, 1 kiss and true romance.
On Co-Ed Records in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the group had multiple top 40 songs. In February 1959, their most popular song, 16 Candles, reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, selling more than 1 million copies and reaching gold disc status. Step by Step, The Angels Listened In, Trouble in Paradise, 6 Nights a Week, and A Year Ago Tonight are among the group's other hits.
Chance, 1 kiss and true romance, step by step, we climb to heaven.
Sweetest One and My Juanita were released by Joyce Records, and Sweetest One reached number 86 on the charts. They followed up with a third song, No One to Love, and a year of live performances. A chance encounter with legendary music producer George Paxton led to a partnership with Paxton's new label, Co-Ed Records, minus Patricia Vandross, whose mother refused to let her go out on tour with the group. 42. The Five Royales. Mixing gospel with rhythm and blues, the Five Royales created songs that would become standards for decades to come. Find out how their music paved the way for soul legends. This R&B group and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame members had a string of hits throughout the 1950s. The group scored 7 straight charting single hits from 1952 to 1954. Despite a change from Apollo Records to King Records, the group scored several more hits until the decade's end. The group's versions of Think and Dedicated to the One I Love are still considered classics. Their soulful tunes are filled with elements from multiple genres, including doo-wop and blues. The vocal group became a cornerstone of the soul music to come. Although they sometimes fell short of commercial success, many of their greatest songs were made popular by such stars as James Brown and Aretha Franklin. 41. The Larks. Their name might sound familiar, but the Larks' story is full of twists and turns that kept them performing for over a decade. Don't miss how they left their mark on the early R&B scene. The Larks were an American singing group that was active in the early 1950s. They were not to be confused with the Larks, formerly the Meadowlarks of Los Angeles, nor the Philadelphia-based ensemble the Four Larks. This group consisted of Lachey singing and Mark playing guitar and singing backup vocals in the combo. They've been playing together for well over a decade and have performed at innumerable venues, parties, and weddings across Australia. Mark is a secondary music teacher and Lachey studied music at Newcastle Conservatorium. They have the capacity to attract people at any event with their depth of experience and deep tones. Unbelievable is one of their most well-known songs. 40. The Delmore Brothers. They were pioneers of the close harmony sound, blending country and blues into something uniquely their own. Discover how the Delmore Brothers influenced both country and early rock and roll. Alton and Rabin Delmore were a sibling duo whose innovative music bridged the gap between traditional country, blues, and early rock and roll. Formed in the 1930s, their popularity peaked in the 1940s and 50s as they brought a distinctive mix of harmony and instrumental prowess. The Delmore Brothers were among the first to fuse traditional folk music with the boogie-woogie rhythms that would later influence rockabilly. Hits like Blues Stay Away From Me and Freight Train Boogie became staples of their sound, leaving an indelible mark on the music scene. Though they disbanded with Rabin's untimely death in 1952, their influence carried on through future rock legends. 39. The Chantels. As one of the first female groups to break into the mainstream, the Chantels changed the game. You won't want to miss how these talented teens found their way to the top. The Chantels are a pop music band that, after the Bobettes, were the second African American girl group to achieve national popularity in the United States. Students from St. Anthony of Padua School in the Bronx founded the group in the early 1950s. Arlene Smith, lead, October 5, 1941. Sonia Goring Wilson, born Millicent Goring, 1940. Renee Minus White, 1943. Jackie Landry Jackson, May 22, 1941 through December 23, 1997, and Lois Harris were the original 5 The Chantels members, 1940. They got their name from St. Francis de Chantal, a school in Chantal, France. Sonia Goring Wilson, Renee Minus White, Lois Harris Powell, and Ami Ortiz are the current members. Richard Barrett, lead singer of the Valentines, discovered the girls, and by the summer of 1957, they were signed to George Goldner's End Records. In August 1957, they released their first song, He's Gone, pop number 71, penned by Arlene Smith. Maybe, their second song, was released in December 1957 and became a smash, number 15 Billboard Hot 100, number 2 R&B chart in January 1958. It received a gold disc after selling over 1 million copies. 38. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. They were young, fresh, and full of talent, but Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers' story is a tragic tale of fame and downfall. Stay tuned to see how their legacy lives on. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers are considered one of the earliest rock and roll success stories thanks to the hit Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The first youth rock and roll group also hit big with I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent and the ABCs of Love. However, success was dangerous for Lyman, who developed a heroin addiction at age 15 and died at 25 because of the drug. The Teenagers continued to perform without Lyman and received induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, American vocal group popular in the mid-1950s, prime exponents of the doo-wop vocal style. The broad-based success of this vocal ensemble helped signal the emergence of rock and roll as a part of mainstream teenage culture. The prepubescent soprano of 13-year-old lead singer Lyman, sounding innocent and girlish, represented one of the most appealing sounds in early rock and roll, and many later pop groups would feature a preteen male lead, most notably the Jackson 5. The Teenagers' first successful record, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, 1956, was followed by 5 more singles that appeared on the national survey lists of the most popular records in the United States. The Teenagers also appeared in 2 popular rock and roll movies starring disc jockey Alan Freed, Rock, 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 1956, and Mr. Rock and Roll, 1957. 37. The Cleftones. From high school talent shows to national fame, the Cleftones' rise was anything but typical. Hear how this group from Queens crafted some unforgettable hits that still make us sway. The Cleftones were an American vocal doo-wop group formed in 1955 in Jamaica, Queens, New York. They were then called the Silvertones in junior high. The original The Cleftones members were Herbie Cox, lead singer, Charlie James McGee, first tenor, Berman Patterson, second tenor, Warren Corbin, bass, and William Buzzy McLean, baritone. They began performing at community events, concerts, and even a Jewish summer camp. In 1955, well-known producer George Goldner signed them to a recording contract and renamed them the Cleftones. They had a few little hits, but nothing truly blew up in their favor. Corbin and Patterson wrote You Baby You, a smash in 1955 on their first attempt as professional musicians. For the ensemble, Herb Cox penned Little Girl of Mine and Can't We Be Sweethearts. However, after a few small songs, Why You Do Me Like You Do and See You Next Year, they would not have another significant hit for years. 36. The Five Keys. Their harmonies were flawless, but the Five Keys struggled to find chart success despite their talent. Let's explore how they helped shape the R&B scene in the early 50s. The Five Keys, an American R&B vocal quartet that contributed to the development of the early 1950s rhythm and blues movement. The group was founded as the Sentimental Four in 1945 in Newport News, Virginia, and originally consisted of two sets of brothers, Rudy West, first tenor, born July 25, 1932 in Newport News, Virginia, USA, died May 14, 1998 in USA, Bernie West, bass, born February 4, 1930 in Newport News, Virginia, USA, and Ripley Ingram, octave tenor, born 1929, died March 23, 1995 in Newport News, Virginia, USA, and Raphael Ingram, second tenor. The group's name was altered to Five Keys in 1949 after Raphael Ingram departed and Edwin Hall, baritone, and James Dickey Smith, second tenor, born 1933 USA, joined. The Five Keys signed Los Angeles-based Aladdin Records in 1951 with Pierce, Smith, and Rudy West sharing lead vocal duties, with Ripley Ingram contributing the genre-defining floating tenor aspect at the time. That same year, the group scored a hit with a cover of the classic song The Glory of Love, which peaked at #1 on the US R&B chart. The group was now accompanied by pianist Joe Jones, who is unrelated to the previous guitarist. Even though they produced an enticing mix of classic standards and R&B originals for Aladdin, the Five Keys were unable to achieve additional chart success. 35. Sir John's Trio. Before Chuck Berry was a household name, he was just the guitarist for Sir John's Trio. Stick around to see how this band helped launch one of rock and roll's greatest legends. Johnny Johnson is known as the baddest right hand in the land to many, and his career received new light in the decade since he burst onto the rock scene. Johnson's band, Sir John's Trio, may not have had too many accolades, but one member in particular helped change rock music forever. Guitarist Chuck Berry joined the trio in 1952 and quickly became the group's frontman. Berry would soon become a pioneer in rock and roll, but his work in Sir John's Trio led to such hits as Maybelline and Sunday Blues. Remember, it's not where you end in life, it's all about where you came from. 34. The Heartbeats. Their biggest hit, 1,000 Miles Away, still tugs at the heartstrings. Learn how the Heartbeats rose to fame and then faded away, leaving behind a doo-wop classic. The Heartbeats were a 1950s American doo-wop group best known for their song 1,000 Miles Away, which charted at number 53 in the US Billboard listings in 1957. The Heartbeats began as a quartet in early 1953 in Jamaica, Queens as the Hearts, consisting of baritone Vernon Sievers, bass Wally Roker, first tenor Albert Crump, and second tenor Robbie Tatum. When it was later discovered that there was a female group of the same name who scored a minor Billboard hit with Lonely Nights, the male group extended their name to Heartbeats. They were signed shortly after James Shep Shepard joined the group as lead vocalist and were shuffled between various production companies and record labels over the next few years. The group split up in 1959 and Shepard went on to form Shep and the Limelights. Roker remained in the music business as a promoter while the other group members went on to other professions. James Shepard died in his automobile under mysterious circumstances in 1970. 33. The Diablos. They weren't just a Detroit R&B group, they were innovators of the doo-wop sound with a unique style. Let's take a look at how the Diablos left a lasting impact with hits like The Wind. Nolan Strong and the Diablos, also billed as The Diablos featuring Nolan Strong, were an American Detroit-based R&B doo-wop vocal group best known for their songs The Wind and Mind Over Matter. They had one record that spent a week on the Billboard R&B chart, The Way You Dog Me Around, which reached number 12 in January 1956. The group was one of the more popular pre-Motown R&B acts in Detroit during the mid-50s through the early 60s. Its original members were Nolan Strong, Juan Gutierrez, Willie Hunter, Quentin Eubanks, and Bob Edwards. The group recorded for Fortune Records along with label mates Andre Williams and Nathaniel Mayer. The Diablos recorded for the family-operated label in Detroit starting in 1954 until around 1964, with some of their records still being released through the 1970s. 32. The Coasters. With their witty lyrics and catchy tunes, the Coasters were a comedy act and a hit machine rolled into one. Find out how they became the first vocal group inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In 1987, this group became the first vocal group to get inducted into the famous Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The legacy of the Coasters was worth their entry. The name derives from how they traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast. The biggest hit for the band, Yakety Yak, is still considered one of the most electric rock and roll songs and doo-wop hits ever recorded. Their upbeat sounds and beautiful instrumental melodies cement them as one of the best 50s rock bands. The group had a series of rock and roll hits, largely for Atlantic Records' subsidiary label Atco, with witty Lieber Stoller songs directed at teenage listeners. Searchin' and Young Blood, both 1957, Yakety Yak, 1958, and Charlie Brown and Poison Ivy, both 1959. The Coasters alternated lead singers and featured clever arrangements, including amusing bass replies and tenor saxophone solos by King Curtis, who played a crucial role in creating Atlantic's rhythm and blues sound. With further personnel changes, they continued performing in oldies shows into the 1990s. The Coasters were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987. 31. The Bunnies. Not as widely remembered today, the Bunnies had a tight harmony and stage presence that captivated audiences. Stick with us to find out how this group made a mark on 50s music. Emerging from the vibrant music scene of the 1950s, the Bunnies captivated audiences with their energetic performances and catchy tunes. Known for their tight harmonies and polished stage presence, they stood out in a decade brimming with musical innovation. Their hits resonated with the youth, who found in their music a sense of rebellion and excitement that mirrored the changing social landscape. Though not as widely remembered today as some of their contemporaries, the Bunnies played a crucial role in shaping the sound and style of early rock and roll. 30. Buddy Holly and the Crickets. He might be a household name, but Buddy Holly's work with the Crickets changed rock and roll forever. Discover the tragic end of this legendary group and the legacy they left behind. Buddy Holly is a name synonymous with dying too young. Considering where his career with his band The Crickets was heading, you cannot argue this is incorrect. Holly formed his band with Nicky Sullivan, Jerry Allison, and Joe B. Malden in 1957. 7 months later, the band had a hit on their hands with the release of That'll Be the Day, which peaked at number 3 on the Billboard charts. While the band did splinter while Holly worked on his solo career, they planned on getting back together until disaster struck. Holly died in a plane crash that killed fellow artist Ritchie Valens in 1959 in an event known as the Day the Music Died. The Crickets reformed, but the Holly-sized hole in the band was apparent. 29. The Skyliners. Their ballads became the soundtrack of teenage heartbreak in the 50s. Get ready to revisit the Skyliners and the unforgettable Since I Don't Have You. The Skyliners are a Pittsburgh-based American doo-wop group. Jimmy Beaumont, lead, Janet Vogel, soprano, Wally Lester, tenor, Jackie Taylor, bass voice guitarist, and Joe Verscharen, baritone, made up the original band. The Skyliners' biggest success was Since I Don't Have You, which they released in 1959. This I Swear and Pennies from Heaven were other top 40 hits for the Skyliners. It Happened Today, 1959, Close Your Eyes, 1961, and Comes Love, 1962, are among the other favorites. The original group disbanded in 1963, but reformed 11 years later, without Jackie Taylor, for Where Have They Gone, which became their final charting single. 28. The Flamingos. Smooth, soulful, and iconic, the Flamingos brought us one of the greatest love songs of all time. Stay with us to see why I Only Have Eyes for You still stands the test of time. American doo-wop group The Flamingos was founded in Chicago in 1953. The band rose to fame in the middle to late 1950s and is renowned for its 1959 rendition of I Only Have Eyes for You. Since then, they have been praised as one of the best and most significant vocal ensembles in the annals of pop and doo-wop music. The group was admitted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. On the list of the 500 greatest songs of all time by Rolling Stone magazine, the band's cover of I Only Have Eyes for You came in at number 158. The Flamingos' first single for Chance Records, If I Can't Have You, and the follow-up, That's My Desire, were both moderately successful in their respective local markets, but it was Johnny Carter's composition of Golden Teardrops, with its intricate vocal harmonies, and Carter's soaring falsetto that solidified their reputation as a top local act of the time. 27. Flat and Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys. They weren't rock and roll, but their banjo-driven sound bridged the gap between bluegrass and mainstream music. Find out how Flat and Scruggs influenced American music forever. Flat and Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys were instrumental in bringing bluegrass music into the mainstream during the 1950s. Their innovative sound, characterized by Earl Scruggs' pioneering banjo techniques and Lester Flatt's smooth guitar playing, bridged the gap between traditional Appalachian music and the burgeoning rock and roll movement. Their appearances on radio and television, including the popular Beverly Hillbillies theme song, helped them reach a wider audience and solidify their place in music history. The band's influence extended far beyond their genre, leaving an indelible mark on the evolution of American music. 26. The Dominoes. From gospel roots to rock and roll classics, the Dominoes brought something fresh to the music scene. Stay tuned to learn how they became crossover trailblazers with hits like 60-Minute Man. The Dominoes, also sometimes known as Billy Ward and the Dominoes, had one of the finest musical pedigrees of any R&B vocal group of the 1940s, at least based on its founders' training and experience. A lot of R&B acts came out of a gospel background, and Bo Diddley even studied violin as a boy. But rare is the R&B vocal group whose founder was trained at Juilliard. The Dominoes, with McFadder's high tenor lead, had a startlingly fresh sound and enjoyed a number 6 R&B hit in early 1951 with one song from their first session, Do Something For Me. It was in May of that year that the group broke through to the top of the R&B charts with 60-Minute Man, which also established them as one of the leading crossover acts between gospel and blues. Riding the wave of demand for their performances off of that hit, one of the first great double entendre records of the 50s, and a very early example of what would be considered a rock and roll record, the group spent the next 7 months on the road, building up a lot of public goodwill and a reputation as one of the top R&B acts of the era. 25. Little Richard and the Upsetters. Before he was a rock legend, Little Richard needed a band to back him up. Learn how the Upsetters helped shape the iconic sound of Keep a Knockin' and beyond. Little Richard didn't always see success as a solo artist. The pioneering rock legend joined up with Wilbert Lee Diamond Smith, Nathaniel Buster Douglas, Charles Chuck Connor, and Olsey Bassey Robinson to form the Upsetters as a road band. The band toured on and off from 1953 to the 1960s until Richard decided to pursue gospel music. Still, the group receives credit for at least one hit with Richard, Keep a Knockin'. Funk legend James Brown gave the band its due too, saying they were the ones who helped put the funk in rock and roll. The group was named after Perry's 1968 smash, The Upsetter, and the Upsetter tag was also applied to his record label. Although the lineup was mercurial, essentially the roster consisted of whoever was in the studio the minute the tape began to roll. Among the key Jamaican musicians who passed through the Upsetters' ranks were siblings Aston and Carlton Barrett, Sly Dunbar, Glenn Adams, Winston Wright, and Boris Gardiner. Despite scoring a handful of their own hits, including 1969's Return of Django, the unit was best known as a support act, enjoying their greatest influence through the records they made during the late 1960s and early 1970s with the Wailers, including the seminal Duppy Conqueror, Small Axe, and Soul Rebel. 24. Little Anthony and the Imperials. Little Anthony's voice was unmistakable and his group's hits crossed over from doo-wop to pop stardom. Discover the roller coaster ride of Little Anthony and the Imperials. Little Anthony and the Imperials were a New York City-based rhythm and blues soul vocal group created in the 1950s by Clarence Collins and named after its main vocalist, Jerome Anthony Little Anthony Gourdine, who was known for his high-pitched voice. Ernest Wright, Gloucester Nate Rogers, and Tracy Lord were among the founding Imperials. However, the last two were later replaced by Sammy Strain. Throughout the 1960s, the group was one of the few doo-wop groups to have prolonged success on the R&B and pop charts. On April 4th, 2009, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 23 years after their first year of eligibility. End Records published their first song as the Imperials' Tears on My Pillow. This timeless vocal group ballad was one of the year's biggest songs, peaking at number 2 on the R&B list and number 4 on the pop chart. Little Anthony and the Imperials had become overnight celebrities. The story could have ended there, with Tears on My Pillow being remembered fondly as a vocal group classic from one of the era's numerous one-hit wonders. In fact, despite their success, some of their follow-up songs flopped. The quartet bounced back with Shimmy Shimmy Cocoa Bop, an up-tempo single that capitalized on a dancing fad. 23. The Moonglows. Before Motown, there were the Moonglows, true pioneers of the doo-wop sound. Find out how they went from Alan Freed's favorite group to Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. The Moonglows were a 1950s American R&B group. Sincerely reached number 1 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 20 on the Billboard Jukebox chart. In the year 2000, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Moonglows were the band that most symbolized the beginnings of rock and roll, by which R&B moved from its black subculture to mainstream teen culture. The Moonglows' career matched that of their mentor, famed disc jockey Alan Freed, who made them the cornerstones of his radio broadcasts, motion pictures, and stage presentations during his rise in rock and roll. 22. Huey Piano Smith and the Clowns. They weren't your typical R&B group. Huey Smith and the Clowns had a knack for novelty hits that made you want to dance. Hear the story behind their infectious tunes. For a time, Huey Smith and the Clowns, which featured singer-comedian Bobby Marchin and outstanding New Orleans instrumentalists, toured widely as a result of their 1957-58 novelty hits Rockin' Pneumonia and the Boogie Woogie Flu and Don't You Just Know It. The latter, with its Kubo, Kuba, Kuba, Kuba chorus, was a favorite of American teenagers. The band's final hit was the 1959 Smith song Sea Cruise, sung by a white youth, Frankie Ford. Smith's performances grew increasingly infrequent, and in the early 1980s, his focus turned to religion as he became a Jehovah's Witness. 21. The Falcons. From You're So Fine to launching the careers of soul legends, the Falcons were true trailblazers. Stay tuned to see how this group changed the face of soul music. Often credited as having cut the first true soul record in 1959 with You're So Fine, a host of 60s soul stars call themselves Falcons at one time or another, including founder Eddie Floyd, Wilson Pickett, Sir Mac Rice, and 100 proof aged in soul's Joe Stubbs. Originally an integrated R&B group headed by Floyd, the Falcons debuted on Mercury in 1955. Under the production aegis of Robert West, the Falcons' sound became more gospel-based as time passed, and with Stubbs as lead, the seminal You're So Fine was a major hit in 1959. Pickett screamed the gospel-fired ballad I Found a Love to national prominence on West Lupine label in 1962, backed by guitarist Robert Ward's Ohio Untouchables. When Pickett went solo shortly thereafter, the members went their separate ways. West recruited another group, the Fabulous Playboys, who took over the Falcons' name, but with little success. 20. The Platters. With hits like Only You and The Great Pretender, the Platters were the ultimate vocal group. Find out how this ever-changing lineup became one of the most successful acts of the 50s. Formed in 1952, the Platters began a vocal group that still manages to perform to this day. The group was formed by Herb Reed, Alex Hodge, Cornell Gunter, and Joe Jefferson. Like many of the era's vocal groups, lineup changes meant a constantly reformed roster of talent. Still, this Rock and Roll Hall of Fame group scored 40 hit singles in the 50s and 60s, such as Only You, The Great Pretender, and You've Got the Magic Touch. These days, the band continues to play, but with 4 members not in the original lineup. They live by the band's tagline, Many Voices, One Name. 19. The Chords. Their hit, Shaboom, defined doo-wop for a generation, but the Chord story is far more than just one song. Dive in to see how they brought joy and harmony to the charts. The Chords, an American doo-wop group active from 1951 to 1960, consisted of band members Carl Feaster, Claude Feaster, Jimmy Keys, Floyd Buddy McRae, and William Ricky Edwards. They were first discovered singing in a subway station. This led to a recording contract with Atlantic Records. Best known for Shaboom, the band's only hit was their self-titled debut album. People would be stopping and smiling and waving and hollering. Everybody knew our record. They loved us, band member Buddy McRae said after Shaboom became a hit. Shaboom was their only hit. It was written by James Keys and the rest of the band members. The song was ostensibly about a nuclear detonation, but the song was optimistic in tone and suggested that life could be a dream. 18. Lee Andrews and the Hearts. Lee Andrews and the Hearts made heartbreak sound beautiful with their classic tunes. Stay tuned to explore the hits that defined their career and captured the emotions of a generation. Lee Andrews and the Hearts were an American pop doo-wop quintet formed in 1953 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They released albums on the labels Gotham, Rainbow, Mainline, Chess, United Artists, Grand, and Gowan. They had their 3 biggest songs in 1957 and 1958. Teardrops, Long Lonely Nights, and Try the Impossible, all managed by Kay Williams. Long Lonely Nights charted higher on the R&B list, number 11. Chess took up the group's second single for Mainline, Teardrops, for wider distribution at its peak. It was their biggest hit, reaching number 20 on the pop charts on November 25, 1957, and number 4 on the R&B charts by January 1958. A third hit, Try the Impossible, for the United Artists label, charted at number 33 on the pop charts, June 22, 1958. 17. Don Julian and the Meadowlarks. Before the rise of Motown, Don Julian and the Meadowlarks were making waves on the West Coast. Hear how their unique sound and memorable hits made them local legends. Don Julian and the Meadowlarks were another in the seemingly endless tapestry of R&B vocal groups inhabiting Los Angeles in the 50s. Unlike many teenagers who chose to become musicians or singers, Julian grew up in a non-musical family, did not sing in the church choir, and had no formal vocal training to speak of. While attending John C. Fremont High School in South Central LA, he formed a vocal group, the Meadowlarks, originally the Solinaires, with two classmates, Ronald Barrett and Earl Jones. Earl's brother Randy Jones, later a member of the Flares and the Penguins, joined not long afterward, and it was a quartet that, in 1954, had two singles released on Joe Behari's RPM label, credited to the Meadowlarks. Their first A-side, Love Only You, was clearly modeled on G by the Crows, one of the first R&B hits to cross over to the pop charts. The Meadowlarks also sang background for Percy Mayfield as the Maytones on two specialty singles. 16. Buddy Knox and the Rhythm Orchids. Buddy Knox didn't just play rockabilly, he lived it, bringing us infectious hits that topped the charts. Find out how Knox and the Rhythm Orchids define the sound of early rock and roll. Buddy Knox and the Rhythm Orchids formed one of the original rockabilly acts in rock and roll, had a career that paralleled that of Buddy Holly, and released the #1 song in the 50s. Buddy was born Buddy Wayne Knox in 1933 in Happy, Texas. In 1948, he wrote a song that he called Party Doll. In 1955, while a student at West Texas State University, Buddy Knox formed a group called the Rhythm Orchids that included himself on guitar and vocals, Jimmy Bowen on bass, and Don Lanier on lead guitar. He later added Dave Aldred on drums. As did many groups that recorded in West Texas in the 50s, Buddy's group eventually found its way to Norman Petty's studio in Clovis, New Mexico. It was the same studio where Buddy Holly and the Crickets started their recording career. In 1957 and 58, Buddy Knox and the Rhythm Orchids placed a total of 8 songs on the charts that they recorded on the Roulette label, including Rock Your Little Baby to Sleep, Hula Love, a top 10 song, and Somebody Touched Me. Buddy Knox appeared in the movie Jamboree along with some of the top rock and roll stars of the day in 1957. He promoted his songs on Alan Freed's package tours. 15. Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio. Johnny Burnett and his bandmates helped put rockabilly on the map with their wild, energetic sound. Get ready to hear how these Memphis boys made history with their raw rock and roll style. 3 Memphis, Tennessee natives got together and formed a rockabilly group that helped put the genre on the map. Active for only 6 years as a band, Johnny Burnett, Dorsey Burnett, and Paul Burleson still managed to create a classic self-titled album. In particular, their version of Train Kept A-Rollin' is considered a rockabilly classic. Their unique sound and sheer talent earned them a spot as one of the best 50s rock bands. 14. Sonny Till and the Orioles. The Orioles were the original R&B balladeers whose smooth harmonies and emotional delivery set the stage. Find out why they're known as the founding fathers of rhythm and blues. Sonny Till and the Orioles were the founding fathers of rhythm and blues, along with the Ravens and the premier love song balladeers of the late 40s and early 50s. With their smooth style, the Orioles had more of an influence on R&B groups of the next 20 years than almost any other act. While the Ravens brought prominence to black groups by doing white swing material, the Orioles were the first black group to gain national popularity by recording black songs. The Orioles became the innovators of what would later be defined as pure R&B 4-part harmony. In his book, They All Sang on the Corner, Phil Groia described the Orioles as having a mellow, soft second tenor lead, a blending baritone featured as a gravel-gurdy second lead, a floating high first tenor, and a dominant bass. This description would easily fit some of the great 1940s gospel groups like the Soul Stirrers. It's more than likely these gospel legends inspired Till and Company. On the release of It's Too Soon to Know, the song climbed to number 13, number 1 R&B. Never before had a black act singing black music reach the pop top 15. Their next release, Lonely Christmas, reached number 8 on the R&B chart. 2 singles later, Tell Me So became their second R&B number 1. A Billboard reviewer described it as one of those slow, easy torch ballads that lend themselves to the group's glistening note bending style. Could be an important platter in the race mart. More great ballads followed. A Kiss and a Rose, number 12. Forgive and Forget, number 5 R&B, 1949. And What Are You Doing New Year's Eve, number 9, 1949. The flip side hit number 5, a second charting for Lonely Christmas, now on its way to becoming a Christmas perennial. 13. The Penguins. Known for Earth Angel, the Penguins were more than just one-hit wonders. Stick around to learn about the drama, lawsuits, and successes that shaped this iconic group. Best known for their hit single Earth Angel, the doo-wop quartet The Penguins were never able to replicate the success of their only top 40 hit, but the song became a rock and roll classic. The Penguins formed in 1954 when the members, Cleveland Duncan, lead vocal, Curtis Williams, tenor vocal, Dexter Tisby, baritone vocal, and Bruce Tate, tenor vocal, were all attending Fremont High School in Los Angeles, California. Although he wasn't the lead singer, Williams was the leader of the group. He learned Earth Angel from vocalist Jesse Belvin. Some sources claim that Williams wrote the song alone, others say he co-wrote the song with Belvin, while still others claim Gaynell Hodge, a member of the doo-wop group The Turks, wrote the song with the duo. In fact, Hodge won a lawsuit filed in 1956 that gave him a co-writing credit and had the Penguins sing the song. Around 1954, the Penguins signed with the local Los Angeles independent label Doo-Tone Records. The group's first single was going to be the up-tempo Hey Señorita, and the ballad Earth Angel was going to be the B-side. Upon the release of the single in the latter half of 1954, Los Angeles radio stations were receiving more requests for Earth Angel. 12. The Isley Brothers. From shout to twist and shout, the Isley Brothers' music spanned generations. Dive in to see how these legends became one of the longest performing groups in history. The Isley Brothers began as a vocal trio in 1954, but the group's work has spanned 8 decades. They remain one of the longest performing and most influential music groups in history. After the death of their brother Vernon, the then trio moved from Cincinnati, Ohio to New York City. They quickly rose to prominence in the latter half of the decade. Their first million-copy single was Shout, which topped the Billboard Hot 100 in 1959. 11. The Five Satins. If you've ever slow danced to In the Still of the Night, you've heard the Five Satins. Discover how this group created one of the most iconic ballads of the 50s. The Five Satins are an American doo-wop group best known for their million-selling song In the Still of the Night from 1956. They began playing in 1954 and continued till 1994. The group originally had 6 members, but that number was subsequently reduced to 5. In 2003, the Five Satins were inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame. In November 1957, the follow-up single Pretty Baby, That's Why I Sing received weeks of playing on Strong CHUM in Toronto. A Night to Remember, released in August 1958, received modest Boston airplay. Their classic 45 side received renewed current playing in late 1959 in San Francisco and early 1960 in both San Antonio, Texas and Rochester, New York, becoming a top 10 hit in all 3 locations. 10. The Everly Brothers. Their harmonies were perfect, their hits were timeless, and their influence was unmatched. Learn how the Everly Brothers became country rock pioneers with songs that still resonate today. The Everly Brothers, consisting of Don and Phil Everly, began writing and recording music as a duo in 1956, and success soon followed. The pair scored a hit with Bye Bye Love in 1957. Their hit songs continued in the years that followed. Wake Up Little Susie, All I Have to Do Is Dream, and Problems became radio mainstays. The pair did split briefly to join the United States Marine Corps Reserves, but continued to produce, write, and record music. Their popularity declined, but the brothers still appeared all over the US until Phil died in 2014. 9. Otis Williams and the Charms. You've heard their hits, but do you know their story? Otis Williams and the Charms were more than just another doo-wop group. Stay with us to see how they took the R&B world by storm. Otis Williams and the Charms were an American doo-wop vocal group in the 1950s who were originally billed as the Charms. Williams is not related to Otis Williams of the Temptations. The group, which Williams named the Charms, performed Rags to Riches in the Withrow Minstrels in May 1954, where they were seen in the opening show by Sid Nathan of King Records. Nathan only wanted to sign Williams, but Williams insisted on taking the rest of the group along. They signed immediately to a subsidiary label, Rockin' Records, based in Florida and owned by Henry Stone, later of TK Records, with Williams giving up a sports career to pursue singing instead. As a condition of their signing, Nathan required that the Charms pull out of the Minstrels, and so they did not appear in the subsequent 5 performances of the 1954 production. The Charms' first record in June 1953, Heaven Only Knows, was not a hit, and after a couple more releases, they moved to another King subsidiary label, Deluxe Records, also run by Stone. They recorded several more times before, in 1954, Heart of Stone gave them their first and biggest hit, reaching #1 on the R&B charts for 9 weeks at the end of the year. It sold over 1 million copies, their first recording to do so, and was awarded a gold disc. It also reached #15 on the pop chart with a cover version by the Fontaine Sisters reaching #1. 8. The Rock and Roll Trio. Raw, rebellious, and ahead of their time, the Rock and Roll Trio brought rockabilly to the world. Get ready to hear how their electrifying sound caught the attention of future rock legends. The Rock and Roll Trio were an American rockabilly group formed in Memphis, Tennessee during the 1950s. They were also known as Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio and the Johnny Burnett Trio. The members of the trio were Dorsey Burnett, his younger brother Johnny, and a friend Paul Burleson. Their first single was You're Undecided, an early indication of their rockabilly style, backed with Go Mule Go, Vaughn 1006, released under the name Johnny Burnett. It sold fewer than 200 copies. Though the Rock and Roll Trio quickly faded into memory in the United States, and the Let It All Out rock of Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and pre-army Elvis gave way to saccharine-drenched substitutes, their rough and ready brand of rockabilly eventually caught the attention of wannabe rockers in jolly old England. 7. The Del Vikings. They broke racial barriers and made history with hits like Come Go With Me. Learn how the Del Vikings music became a symbol of unity and one of the first integrated groups to achieve mainstream success. The Del Vikings, or Del Vikings, were a doo-wop group with multiple hit singles in the 1950s. Their songs Whispering Bells and Come Go With Me are musically exquisite and historically significant because of their racial integration. The group started in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, while the original members were stationed with the Air Force. This initial startup led to numerous interruptions to their work when members would be transferred. But by 1957, Come Go With Me hit #5 on the Billboard Top 100. 6. The Spaniels. Known for their beautiful harmonies and smooth ballads, the Spaniels gave us timeless hits. Let's dive into how they helped shape the sound of R&B with classics like Goodnight Sweetheart, Goodnight. The Spaniels were an American R&B and doo-wop group best known for the hit Goodnight Sweetheart, Goodnight. Their original members included Thornton James Pookie Hudson, June 11, 1934 to January 16, 2007, Ernest Warren, December 2, 1933 to May 7, 2012, Willie C. Jackson, died February 18, 2015 at 79 years old, Opal Courtney Jr., November 22, 1936, September 18, 2008, and Gerald Gregory, June 10, 1934 to February 12, 1999. They also started a trend of incorporating tap dance routines in live performances and were one of the first R&B groups to perform with the main singer using one microphone and the rest of the group sharing another. The purity of a sound and manner that is exclusively their own may be heard on several of their a cappella albums. The Spaniels also played a role in the development of VJ, one of the most successful black-owned record labels in the nation and a legendary R&B label. 5. Danny and the Juniors. With their anthem At the Hop, Danny and the Juniors made rock and roll history. Discover how they captured the spirit of teenage rebellion and kept rock and roll alive. Danny and the Juniors shot straight to the top of the charts in early 1958 with their biggest hit ever, the gold-selling At the Hop, penned by the songwriting team of Dave White and John Madara, though they reached the charts again with 8 more singles through 1963, notably the top 40 charters Rock and Roll Is Here to Stay, Dottie, and Twistin' USA. In the early 60s, the group switched over to the Swan label, and after their last song charted in 1963, Danny and the Juniors eventually parted ways. 4. The Harp Tones. Often overlooked, the Harp Tones crafted some of the most beautiful doo-wop harmonies of the era. Get ready to rediscover their soulful hits and smooth vocal style. Despite their failure to achieve the commercial success of rivals like the Drifters, the Flamingos, or the Clovers, the Harp Tones demand consideration in any serious discussion of the truly immortal acts of the doo-wop era. Although none of their singles cracked the top 40, efforts like A Sunday Kind of Love, Life Is But a Dream, and Memories of You remain classics of the genre, distinguished by their rich harmonies and sophisticated jazz-inspired arrangements. The Harp Tones' origins date to 1951 in the grounds of Harlem's Wadley Junior High School, where classmates William Dempsey, Curtis Cherubin, and Freddie Taylor began harmonizing as the Skylarks. Following the additions of Eugene Sonny Cook and a classmate remembered only by the nickname Skillum, the fledgling group made its professional debut via the Apollo Theater's famed Amateur Talent Contest, performing a rendition of My Dear Dearest Darling that ended in the audience literally booing them off the stage. After a series of lineup shuffles, the Skylarks welcomed William Dicey Galloway, who concurrently served as a member of another fledgling Harlem doo-wop unit, the Winfield Brothers. In early 1953, alumni of both groups combined as the Harps, comprising tenor Dempsey, baritone Galloway, and lead tenor Willie Winfield, first tenor Claudie Nicky Clark, bass Billy Brown, and pianist-arranger Raul Sita. The Harps returned to the Apollo in November 1953 and earned top honors with their soulful rendition of the Louis Prima composition, A Sunday Kind of Love. Even more significantly, at the end of the evening, an MGM record executive in the audience invited the group to audition at the label's 1650 Broadway studio. 3. The Dells. The Dells were one of the longest-running R&B groups known for their dynamic harmonies and timeless ballads. Find out how they maintained success across decades and became one of the few groups to adapt through changing music eras. The Dells formed in 1952 in Harvey, Illinois, and originally performed doo-wop before evolving into one of the most enduring and influential R&B vocal groups. Their hits like Oh What a Night and Stay in My Corner became anthems of romance and nostalgia. Unlike many of their contemporaries, the Dells managed to stay relevant through the 60s, 70s, and beyond, reinventing their sound while staying true to their roots. With a career that spanned over 50 years, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004, solidifying their legacy as R&B legends. 2. Dion and the Belmonts. Teen idols with a rebellious edge, Dion and the Belmonts gave voice to the youth of their time. Stick around to hear how they became legends of the rock and roll era. Dion and the Belmonts were a popular vocal group in the 1950s and 60s. The name the Belmonts comes from the avenue where Fred Milano lived. It consisted of Angelo D'Aelio, Carlo Mastrangelo, Fred Milano, and from 1958 to 1960, Dion DiMucci. The band started at the birth of rock and roll in the early 50s and was one of a select handful of artists to be making new music after 50 years. The original band members were Fred Milano, Angelo D'Aelio, and Carlo Mastrangelo. Dion DiMucci would join the band in 1958 and go solo in 1960. Their most popular songs that most people would recognize are Teenager in Love, March of 1959, and In the Still of the Night, June 1960. Dion DiMucci was the leading vocalist of the band until he went solo in 1960. 1. Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, the originators of the twist and a band that pushed the boundaries of rock and roll. See why Hank Ballard and the Midnighters top our list for the best gone groups of the 50s. Hank Ballard and the Midnighters are one of the most influential bands on this list, helping kickstart and maintain rock and roll as a genre in the 50s. The group began with Ballard joining a group previously known as the Royals. The band soon changed its name to the Midnighters and scored a string of risque hits like Get It that got banned from radio play by the Federal Communications Commission. That issue never went away with the band, even after several other hits like Work With Me Annie and Annie's Aunt Fanny. But there was one song from the Midnighters that became a monster success for another artist. Ballard wrote a little dance song called The Twist that was covered a year later in 1960 by Chubby Checker. Thanks for tuning in and taking a trip back to the 50s with us. If you love this journey through forgotten music, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos on classic rock, doo-wop, and more hidden gems. See you in the next one!